Welcome to this presentation on enabling endpoint security management with Microsoft Endpoint Manager and Defender ATP services. I'm Dilip Radhakrishnan. I'm the Group Program Manager for Endpoint Manager.
Yeah, hi, my name is Matt Shadbold. I'm a Principal PM on the Microsoft Endpoint Manager team.
It's been about a year since we last presented to you about this topic. As you can see, we were on stage, physically in a room. The world has changed since then. It's not just the conference like Ignite that have adapted and changed and went online, but entire business models have changed. Digital transformations that used to take years have happened in a matter of mere months. In the early phases of COVID pandemic, we really helped our customers quickly adapt and help them enable their employees to securely work from home. But currently we are focusing on the recovery phase. We're helping them manage their risks, cut their costs down. And this crisis also has fundamentally changed the way we prioritize our features and build our services. In this session, we would like to share some of the best practices that these customers who adopted better than others did. A lot of our customers who have had success with addressing this COVID pandemic are those that were early adopters of Microsoft Zero Trust strategy. These customers did not rely on traditional perimeter network security solutions like VPNs or reverse proxies, but instead they treated every access to corporate data as if it was occurring from an untrusted device, from an untrusted network, from an untrusted app. So they also assumed that there was a breach in their environment, and they used our services like Defender ATP to monitor those threats and mitigate it through Endpoint Manager's policy system. But for these customers, moving to Zero Trust was not just adopting a single product or a platform, but in this particular case, it is a journey, right? Across their identity, devices, and apps and network, they'll start from a traditional mode to move advanced to more optimal. So for example, in devices world, the traditional devices would be domain join managed with group policy or config manager. But in the advanced model, they're going to be tied to a cloud identity with Azure Active Directory, and also tied to the Microsoft Endpoint Manager. In the more optimal world, they are also taking advantage of the device threats and the risks that happen and get detected by ATP, and then tied into the conditional access and access control through Microsoft Endpoint Manager. The second set of best practices some of these customers adopted was to make sure that they break down the silos between security and IT teams, or at least connect the silos. Because in every company, there's the SecOps team and the IT team, and they have to really collaborate well together. For example, in a particular scenario where the enterprise had deployed our Defender ATP service, they would have detected there was a vulnerability out in the wild that was getting exploited, and there was an app that needs to be patched. This particular case, they would create the system would automatically create a task and notify the IT teams that these applications have to be remediated. And Matt will be showing a demo of these later in the presentation. The other main concept that these customers adopted was the capability that Microsoft Endpoint Manager provided by offering a single pane of glass for the Microsoft 365 administrators for security management. So in this console that Matt will be demonstrating, we have all the security knobs needed for antivirus, firewall, disk protection, all that available from a single pane of glass. And whether you are managing the device through the cloud, or you are co-managed through Intune, or whether you're doing cross-platform with iOS or Android, they were all getting managed through a single pane of glass. And we also expanded that to cover that through Config Manager. And we again will show a lot of demos of how we address Win 10 and Windows Server through SCCM managed devices. The third most important thing they did was to make sure that they think about security not just for Windows, but think about it cross-platform. Right? So if it's iOS or Android or Mac devices, it doesn't matter, right? They'll be treated just like any Windows device. And again, the malicious apps and network exploits are all monitored on those devices, and the signals are sent into Microsoft Endpoint Manager in order for it to be blocked and remediated if they have exploits on them. In order for you to get started with your endpoint security journey, you can get started with what you have today with Microsoft Intune and Systems in the Config Manager. So even with your E3 license, you can do Defender, AV, firewall configuration, disk encryption, security baseline, conditional access policies, etc. In addition to that, if you also procure and have licenses to our Microsoft 365 E5 suite or the security suite that includes the Defender ATP product, you can also do more advanced features like EDR, security tasks, tamper protection, etc. So Matt's going to do a walkthrough of what's available with E3 SKU with your security management, as well as what you get with the additional E5 licenses. Now over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Dilip. As Dilip mentioned, there's a huge amount of value for our E3 customers when it comes to endpoint security management. Now I'm going to show you some of the highlights of our endpoint security experiences for these E3 features. First, let's take a tour of the endpoint security node and create a new Windows firewall policy. While we have literally thousands of settings available in Microsoft Endpoint Manager for device configuration across Windows, macOS, iOS, and Android, we wanted to provide a dedicated SecAdmin experience for configuring basic device configuration and security for Windows and Mac. So we built out this endpoint security node in the MEM console. The endpoint security node is a one-stop shop for a SecAdmin for configuring and monitoring and managing the device security for Windows and macOS. When you attach the MDATP console to the endpoint security console, a whole bunch of extra features start lighting up, such as security tasks and device risk into compliance. But there's a bunch of settings and configuration experiences here that are available for Microsoft 365 E3 customers. Things like antivirus, disk encryption, and firewall management are all available without a Microsoft 365 E5 subscription. I just wanted to walk you through the endpoint security console just briefly here. Let's start with all devices. The all devices view is exactly the same devices view as the all devices in our devices node. However, we put this in here so our SecAdmins didn't need to switch contexts to view the individual device configuration. Each one of these devices in the list is either managed by Microsoft Intune or Configuration Manager on-prem. And clicking through these devices will show the device configuration, the device ownership, primary users, and things like OS version. Security baselines are a good place for a lot of organizations to start and make sure that their Windows devices are set to a baseline that Microsoft recommends. We have a Windows 10 security baseline, which configures really everything within Windows. We have a Microsoft Defender ATP baseline, which configures all of the Defender ATP pieces to Microsoft best practice. And we also provide an Edge and Microsoft Office baseline. Moving down to our policy experiences, we have a left nav node for antivirus, disk encryption, firewall, EDR, attack surface reduction, and account protection. Each of these left nav nodes provides dedicated experience for managing settings and deployments, as well as reporting. Now I just want to show you how an organization might configure the firewall. Here I'm going to click Create Policy, and I'm going to select a platform. I can either enable the firewall on my Windows 10 devices or my macOS devices. In my profile option, I have two options here. The first one is my Microsoft Defender firewall policy, which is intended to provide all of the basic firewall settings, such as enabling the firewall for domain, public, and private profiles, and all of the settings that come underneath that. The Microsoft Defender firewall rules policy is intended to provide a specific experience for managing firewall rules. Once I've created the policy and given it a name, I'm presented with all of the options. I can do things like disable the FTP and enable the individual firewall profiles. When I enable each of these profiles, a whole bunch of other options light up underneath it. With these three options selected, the firewall is essentially configured and turned on the client. I can now deploy this off to an Azure AD device or user group, and the firewall will be turned on. Now let's help you lift and shift your GPO firewall rules into modern management with endpoint security. Now that you've got your firewall configured via Endpoint Manager, probably the next thing that you're going to want to do is start configuring some firewall rules. Firewall rules have traditionally been used to really handle exceptions, things like applications that aren't working because certain ports and protocols in Windows Firewall haven't been opened. For many years, administrators have been using group policy for this, so there's lots of legacy settings floating around in a lot of organizations. So you should really take this opportunity to review those firewall rules and make sure that they're still valid when you're modern managing your devices. But for those organizations that do need to migrate their group policy-based rules, we wanted to provide a PowerShell-based tool to help you do that. In this example, I've got about 10 firewall rules that are being deployed via group policy. Now, we have a pretty good management experience for firewall rule creation in the Endpoint Manager console, but creating 10 or 20 or 100 different firewall rules would be quite the task. So to use the tool, the first thing you need to do is download it, and we do that by going to aka.ms/endpoint security firewall rule migration tool. When you run that, you'll be prompted to download a zip file which just contains a PowerShell script. Once the PowerShell script is run, we'll download all of the prerequisites and the tool will be runnable on the target system. So if we move across to PowerShell, I'm just in the temp directory here and I'm going to run the export firewall rules PowerShell script. The first time I run this, I will be prompted for my Intune administrator credentials. And the reason for that is we're actually going to be creating some firewall rule policies in the Endpoint Manager console. We lift and shift all of the local and group policy based firewall rules into the MEM console, and then you're able to target those at your modern managed devices. I'm just going to give this a profile name of Contoso firewall rules, and I'm going to send the telemetry to Microsoft so that we can make it better. And you can see here it's picked up 10 potential firewall rules to migrate. Once that's done, you'll see a summary here saying 10 out of 10 were imported into endpoint security firewall rule. Now we come across into endpoint security just to see the firewall rules that we've created. You can see here the firewall rules have been created with the name Contoso Firewall Rule 0. And you'll see that it's unassigned as well. If I expand my settings out, you'll see all 10 of my firewall rules have been created. And I could obviously modify those if required. For clients that aren't MDM or co-managed, we've been building out management features for config manager only clients. We call this Tenant Attach. Tenant Attach allows us to create endpoint security profiles in the Endpoint Manager web console and target them at on-prem config manager only clients. So to show you how easy it is to enable Tenant Attach and get your configuration manager only clients synced into the MEM console for visibility and management, I'm going to enable Tenant Attach in this config manager site. I'm here in administration and I'm going to select cloud services and co-management. Then I'm going to click the configure co-management button. This is going to bring out the co-management wizard, but it also allows me to enable Tenant Attach. So the first thing I'm going to do is sign in with my administrative credentials into my MEM tenant. Once I've signed in, you'll see an option here to upload to Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. This will essentially sync all of the device metadata from the Config Manager on-prem database into the cloud console so that they should all appear in the all devices list. There's also an option to enable automatic client enrollment for co-management. Co-management will allow us to do all of the rich modern management of the device, but isn't required for Tenant Attach. Here you can see all of my devices are to be synced in, or I could specify a specific collection. And I'm also going to enable endpoint analytics so that you can see the end user experience reporting and so forth. I'm not going to enable co-management in this demo, but this is something that you can do afterwards as well. In my summary screen, I'll get all the details of what I've just configured, and then it'll be enabled. So there's no requirement for Azure AD device join, nothing special that you need to do with group policy or clients. All this is really doing is attaching the on-prem config manager site to the cloud services and syncing in those devices. Once this wizard's complete, all of the Config Manager devices will show up in the All Devices list and allow you to do things like security configuration management and remote actions. Now that we've got Tenant Attach enabled, we can start delivering security policies to clients and servers that are managed by only Configuration Manager. Now I'd like to show you how we can deploy Microsoft Defender AV policies for on-prem Configuration Manager servers and clients from the MEM console. First, we're going to start in our Endpoint Security node and click on Antivirus. Before starting this demo, I'd enable Tenant Attach, which is where we can connect an on-prem Configuration Manager site to the MEM console, syncing device metadata and so forth. The devices aren't directly registered into the MEM service, but rather the metadata is synced between the two cloud consoles and on-prem infrastructure. Once Tenant Attach has been set up, we can actually create certain endpoint security policies in the MEM console, manage them all from the web console, and deliver them down to Configuration Manager on-prem clients without any direct interaction with the client. I'm going to create my policy here now and select my platform being Windows 10 and Windows Server. The profile here is the Microsoft Defender antivirus profile, and all of the settings match those that we have available in MDM. I'm going to give my policy a name and click Next. Now I'm able to come in and configure all of the AV settings that I would expect. When I select Next here, you'll see that the experience is a little bit different to a normal MDM configuration. Here you'll see, rather than deploying to an Azure AD group of devices, we're actually deploying to on-prem Configuration Manager collections. I've synced this Endpoint Security Managed Devices collection from my on-prem Config Manager database so that I can target this policy. When I click Create, the policy will be created in the MEM console and delivered down to the Config Manager database. Now let me switch across to Configuration Manager. As I mentioned, the policy is created in the MEM console with all of the admin intent and configuration settings and delivered down to the on-prem site. And Configuration Manager at that point handles all of the policy deployment and application on the end devices. To see the policy has arrived and that it's been successful, I come into my monitoring node in Configuration Manager and into deployments. You'll see here that I have two policies, Defender AV for Config Manager clients, which is just synced in, and one that was created earlier. You can see here that there's only one PC in this collection, but it is compliant. And I can view the status just like I would any other Configuration Manager policy. So as you can see from those demos, there's a ton of value in our E3 experiences, but we've been working really hard with our friends in Defender ATP team to create some great connected experiences for our E5 customers as well. One of the most exciting features we shipped last year was tamper protection. Tamper protection is a unique feature to M365 where we can protect the Microsoft Defender components on Windows 10 devices to stop malicious actors from disabling security features. Defender ATP and Endpoint Manager coordinate to ensure tamper protection is turned off or on securely. It can only happen because Defender ATP and Endpoint Manager have been built together. This year, I'm excited to announce we've extended this coordination to Configuration Manager only clients. With Config Manager 2006, the tamper protection policies can now be created in the Endpoint Manager console and targeted to on-prem Config Manager clients via Tenant Attach. These clients do not need to be Azure AD joined or MDM managed. Let's see how enabling tamper protection via Tenant Attach works. Now I'm going to create and deploy a tamper protection policy to enable tamper protection on my Config Manager only clients. These devices aren't MDM enrolled and are just on-prem Config Manager managed clients. To do that, I'm going to go to Endpoint Security and then into Antivirus. I'm going to click the Create Policy button, and for the platform, I'm going to select Windows 10 and Windows Server for Configuration Manager. The tamper protection policy setting is sitting in the Windows Security Experience profile, so I'm going to create that profile. and give the policy a name. Now I'm going to enable tamper protection and move over to the deployment. Unlike my MDM clients, I actually need to deploy this policy to a collection of devices in my config manager site. I'm going to select my ATP collection and click Next. Once this policy has been created, the Endpoint Manager console will build a policy body. It'll deliver it down to the on-prem config manager site and distribute it out to my config manager managed clients. Now I'm switching across to my config manager console to view the status of this policy. If I go into monitoring and deployments, you can see here I have a Kathy tamper protection policy. And you can see the 3 devices that are in that collection are successful. Now let's take a look at another area of integration, threat and vulnerability management via security tasks. As Dilip mentioned, we've been working hard to break down the silos between security and IT teams. This year, we're extending our security task framework to also handle security configuration and misconfiguration. At last year's Ignite, we announced the public availability of our threat and vulnerability management integration into the Endpoint Manager console. Threat and Vulnerability Management, or TVM, is a proactive scan on end users' devices to look for misconfigurations and vulnerable applications. The workflow that we enabled allowed security administrators and SecOps teams to notify IT teams of vulnerable applications so that the IT teams can go off and remediate them. This year, we're happy to extend that integration to device configuration. As you can see here in my Threat and Vulnerability Management dashboard, there's a bunch of top security recommendations, and one of them is turn on the Defender antivirus for one exposed machine. Defender ATP has gone off and scanned these devices and noticed that there's one device in my organization that doesn't have Defender AV turned on, and obviously we want the IT team to enable that. Going into the security recommendation, I get the list of the devices and a way to raise an IT service ticket in Intune. By ticking this and putting in some more information, this will allow me to raise notification in the Endpoint Manager console so that an IT team can go off and remediate them. From the IT team side, in my security tasks, I've got a list of pending actions that I need to take to secure these devices. You can see here there's a new remediation task to turn on Microsoft Defender antivirus. Clicking into it will list out the individual devices that are vulnerable, list out the endpoint security profile the administrator needs to move to deploy the setting, and a bunch of steps on how they might deploy that. All of the demos that I've presented to date have been focused on Windows, but now let's have a look at how we're extending it to mobile. A feature we announced not long ago is Microsoft Defender ATP for Android. What Defender for Android will do is install a Defender agent on an Android device and look for malicious applications and proxies and things like that. Defender ATP reads the risk score based on the active malware on a device and so forth, and Microsoft Endpoint Manager can feed that risk and block access to Exchange Online and SharePoint Online and so forth via our device compliance policies. So let me just show you how we would set up a device compliance policy to block risky Android devices. First, I'm going to click into my device compliance in my endpoint security node, and I'm going to create a new policy. I'm going to select the Android Enterprise platform, and I'm going to apply this for my work profiles. Next, I have all of the normal compliance settings like requiring a PIN and requiring disk encryption and so forth. But for this one, I'm just going to enable the Microsoft Defender threat protection rules. I'm going to require my devices be clear, and this means that there won't be anything malicious on the device at all. And then I'm going to deploy that to my users. Now I'm over on my Android device. I'm just in the store here installing this test virus app. As you would expect, Defender ATP should pick this up and notify the user that a malicious app has been installed on their device. As we've created a compliance policy in Endpoint Manager, we're expecting that Outlook is going to block access based on the device not being clean. the user has the opportunity to go back into the Defender ATP app and uninstall the malicious app. And then when the device is clear, they can relaunch Outlook and access will be granted.
Thank you, Matt, for the awesome demos. For those of you who are watching this presentation, one of the first call to actions would be to check out the endpoint security node in Endpoint Manager. And if you're an SCCM customer, please do attach your SCCM tenants to the Microsoft Endpoint Manager tenant using the tenant attach feature. So you can now get security capabilities for all the SCCM endpoints, PCs, as well as servers. And the last step is if you're an E5 customer or if you're evaluating the Defender ATP suite, then you can easily use the Microsoft Endpoint Manager to onboard all your devices into the Defender ATP suite. You can operationalize all the awesome security workflows that Matt showed to enable better collaboration between the security and IT teams. And we'll also recommend you to turn on tamper protection for all those devices. Thank you for joining us in this session. Hope you can make Microsoft Endpoint Manager an integral part of your Zero Trust journey.